let's say, to solve the problem at a 50% rate in the next 5 to 10 years? Put a dollar figure on it.
15 million a year.
Thanks for doing this, Izzy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Tell me who you are and what you do.
It's funny because when people ask what do you do, I almost feel like that's a very like working world question, right? It's hard for entrepreneurs in a lot of senses to answer that because we do so much that's hard to put in the box.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in the community development space or economic development space, it can be a loaded question. But for purposes of making it easy for people, I do strategy development. So I have a strategy consulting firm called Rise Consulting Group, and we help people grow, scale, or add more systems and structures to better accomplish hard problems. So for a lot of people, I just say we help solve hard problems. So that's the business I'm in. Strategy consultants is like, what do they do? I don't know. No one knows. Sometimes we don't even know. So that's why we get jobs. That's why people pay us.
Yes.
But
that makes sense.
I think for these purposes, a lot of what I do is try to best empower entities who are trying to do good things in the city.
Particularly being in Kansas City. And I know some of your work relates to small businesses. Strategically, when you advise companies or entities in general, and I would imagine small businesses are to some extent involved in that umbrella and category. Let's discuss the importance of small businesses in Kansas City and the area. How important are small businesses?
It's interesting because sometimes it's easy for us to think, oh, large corporations are the savior, right? But large corporations, and for anyone who's been in a large corporation during either of these recessions, a lot of large corporations fire quietly and hire publicly, right? So you don't hear about the 400 people that they lay off. You just hear about the 400 people they're hiring, right? And so, the true employer of people, at 70% of net new jobs in the city are small businesses, entrepreneurs and small business owners who are building a new future. So, whether we're looking at the tax revenues that those businesses create for the city, right? We're a decently well-taxed city. And so it's easy for a significant amount of each dollar to go to the city in taxes. But we don't necessarily think about, okay, so we have 20,000 small businesses in the city or entrepreneurs in the city, and they're all feeding into the tax base. But they are, right? And all of the people that they employ are paying an earnings tax, are paying, taxes, and then they're the ones who truly generate sales tax for us. If we think about the sales tax isn't coming from a large national global entity that's routing payments all over the globe and maybe through the Philippines or or even a low tax area. The small businesses are the ones that are attracting people to spend their dollars in the city. Your restaurants, your Made in KCs, those types of entities. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of them to both building the fabric of the city, employing people in neighborhoods who might not otherwise be employable, or to generating income for the city's tax base.
That's a staggering number. 70%.
I'll give you some more numbers, right? So small businesses are the number one employer of returning citizens, right? I know crime's on a lot of people's minds right now. I personally have a philosophy that, I correctly predicted the surge in crime pre-pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did a report that said that, crime was going to surge towards the end of the pandemic and afterwards. And similarly, I'm saying that within the next 4 years, if we don't do something about it, crime is going to spread to the suburbs. Right, right now crime is fairly localized. You get a little bit of crime everywhere, but for the most part it's localized. By the way, it's localized in areas that pre-pandemic had 30% unemployment. So if we think about it, I encourage everyone to think about crime not as the problem, but as the symptom of our failed policies and our kicking the can down the road in terms of figuring out how we could create a safe, like not necessarily even safety net, but social services for all, regardless of location, regardless of race, regardless of whatever. When you get laid off, what happens? When your parents die, what happens? Like, they're critical. When you get sick, what happens? And you're a breadwinner for the family, right? There's so many things that can happen that other nations have done such a better job in creating a fallback mechanism that keeps them from falling into poverty, into addiction, into a cycle that ultimately leads, that can lead a lot of places where we don't want them to be, one of which is crime. And so if we think about it more from an economic standpoint, with many of the high crime areas being, having, pre-pandemic 30% unemployment, it really reframes how we look at it as a symptom, and makes us challenge ourselves to think, how can we do more to create equal economic opportunity, right? Especially if we have a school district that, for all intents and purposes, has failed a lot of our students. Right, and that's despite some great leaders and things like that, it was unaccredited for a while, right? And we can't turn our back on that. So now, if you're in a place where you've had the education system that has failed you, what are your career prospects? How do you build a better life when you didn't have all your books? And I think that's something that it's easy to come from an entitled perspective of why don't people just pull themselves up from their bootstraps. But it's easy to say that if you had a great education, right? Now think about if you are coming from a school with no after school programs, where your parents are both working 2 jobs to put food on the table and afford inflation and skyrocketing rents. They don't have childcare, so it prevents many from even entering the workforce to begin with. And you're a student traveling to other schools, and you see the inequality. You see the jumbotron sponsored by Chick-fil-A, right? And some people who watch this will know exactly what I'm talking about. And so it puts a lot of our youth, who are the fastest growing criminal segment in our city, in a place where they feel like the rules are bent already. And so it's nothing to break a rule that's already bent in the system that's clearly slated against you. Yeah. And so that's the power of this conversation. That's the power of us looking at how can we create economic empowerment for all? How can we create ground up economic development? And how can we build small businesses so that they can then employ a lot of those neighborhood people so that they can have access to employment?
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So the small businesses are the ones that are actually employing returning citizens, as you call them. Mm-hmm. How can small businesses play...
And even in neighborhoods in general. Uh-huh. So, with them, with small businesses employing 70%, providing 70% of the net new jobs in the city, that means that they're employing everyone, right? And so you have a 30% that, if not for these small businesses, would still be employed. But 70% is a very big number. And if we look at data, then that shows us where we should be, really focusing our time and energy if we want to create a rising tide for all the ships in the city.
And okay, I see your point. Do you think that they are aware that 70% of the net employment is coming from the smaller businesses in general? And do you think the city has some sort of a support system? I'm talking about locals that are living within those environments to have them support those small businesses. Therefore, it can have a backhanded positive impact that kind of comes around and really grows the city as a whole.
Yeah, you're Emmanuel. You're trying to get me in trouble here. You're trying to get me in trouble.
No, I'm trying to keep it. No, I'm just looking.
No. Here's what I'll say.
From a point of view of are locals aware of that staggering number? Because that's news
I
to
don't
me.
think. I don't think many
Because
people are.
if I knew 70% of the employment is coming from the smaller businesses, I'll be intentional with how I spend my money. And basically, that's what I'm trying to get to.
And I don't think that we're there. I don't think we're there, or else the numbers would say otherwise, right? So if you look at our budget, when I first started really looking into this, we as a city were investing 1,000th of 1% of our budget in supporting and growing entrepreneurship and small business, right? Despite them creating hundreds of millions of tax revenue dollars for the city, right? And so, I think that it does take a little bit of a shift in perspective to say, hey, if it's in our benefit as a city from a financial perspective, tax revenue collection perspective, and GDP perspective, to have to support these small businesses and them creating jobs and them hiring returning citizens. By the way, the small businesses are the number one employer of returning citizens, and if they don't get employed by a small business, they have a 40% likelihood of not getting a job over someone who's less qualified than them in the standard workforce. And if they don't get that job, right, because the rules are kind of slayed against them, you have the checkbox, have you ever been convicted? Do you have crime? So now, are they able to find a place, regardless of what they went to jail for? There are people going to jail for parking tickets, in the city, and they just couldn't afford bond. So then they lose their house, they lose their car, and now instead of paying property tax and sales tax, they're costing us money as a city. But even moving beyond that, if we think about what happens next in that process, if we talk about things like crime, the person who doesn't get employed by a small business or find employment in general, they then have a 65% chance, a higher chance of going back in, right? So they have a 65% higher chance of going back in for an offense. And a lot of times that offense, that second offense, is for a violent crime, regardless of what they went in for to begin with. So you can go in for a parking tickets or plates or whatever, and I do think Mayor Q has done a great job kind of taking that off of the table, so we're not locking people up for parking tickets anymore. But if you think about the impact that then has, if they don't get a job with a small business, they're substantially less likely to get a job in the general workforce. If they don't get a job in the general workforce, then they have a 65% higher chance of going back in, and usually for a violent crime the second time. There's a greater chance for that, regardless of what they went in to begin with. So I think that, from a city perspective, we're just now starting to look at, a city leadership perspective, I think we're just now starting to look at the impact that small business plays in crime prevention and the impact that it plays in building up the city and tax revenues and building up neighborhoods as well, because entrepreneurs are shown to reinvest back at a 40% higher clip into their neighborhoods. Right. So a lot of the problems we're facing are due to the lack of intentionality in supporting small businesses. And so while I won't necessarily, I'll steer a little bit clear of the question of, has the city done a good job supporting small business? Well, actually, I'd say the answer is no. The answer is no, it hasn't. It's done a terrible job, but I think that now with the current city council in our city, there is a will. I think that we need that to go a step further because, during COVID, we saw other cities really value their small businesses, and they understood that small businesses have a 4-to-1 return on investment, right? And so it's profitable for a city to really go all in on investing in their small businesses, which is why we see other small cities invest significantly more than we did. And during the pandemic and afterwards, we saw cities investing 20 million, 60 million in supporting their entrepreneurs and small businesses because they understood that. And I don't think we're there. I think we were in the single digits of that. And so
when you say support in dollar figures, how is that being injected into the small businesses? Is it grants? Is it funding? Is it loans? How is it getting into the hands of small businesses? And let's keep in mind that this is a business channel. Most of the audiences are entrepreneurs. And as you're talking about these issues that are coming up, especially in comparison to other cities, how can this fund get into the hands of small business, therefore they can have the positive impact that you're talking about for the short term and long term ahead?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the answer is all of the above. So those funds deployed in other cities have looked like access to capital funds. So right now, even if your cash flow is, you've seen, I'm sure you've seen this, even if you are a cash flow positive, successful business, if you don't have collateral, it makes it hard for a lot of lending institutions to support you, just by way of the model. And so we have CDFIs who have more flexibility, but it's up to us to give them the funding for the loan loss reserves, or for the collateral replacement funds, so that they can then partner with other lending institutions to provide more flexibility, so that if you're an entrepreneur looking to grow or scale your business, but you may not have a free and clear house that you can that the bank can put a lien on, and with the high enough debt to income ratio, high enough equity in the property, and all of the other things that go into that, there's still options for you. And so I think that the role the city can play in terms of dispersing those funds comes in the form of access to capital through different collateral replacement funds or loan loss reserves in partnership with your CDFIs. And then I think that there's opportunities for for supporting the entrepreneur support organizations that are doing the blocking and tackling with entrepreneurs. So who do you call if you want to know how to scale? Who do you call if you want to understand, how to, the permitting and planning for, a new location or for wherever space you're moving into, and how to, not have that take 8 months.
Okay. So just let's take it back, right? Let's take it back a bit and then talk about the collateral replacing funds that you talked about. So let's kind of break that down, because for me, I'm looking at it from the point of view of, okay, if you don't have a collateral, you're just to start a business, and how am I going to trust that I'm going to get back? And some institutions are lending money that they're getting from their members, right? So they have to be kind of responsible in how they disperse those funds and have that responsibility. How can we break that barrier? Because it seems as though it is a legitimate concern, right? I mean, you see small businesses that are popping up and they exist for about a couple of years, and some statistics show that the majority of them fail, right? Mm-hmm. And how can we have a holistic approach where if we're removing collateral, what are we going to replace it with? And how can we ensure that business is going to succeed and ultimately pay that lender back?
Yeah. And you bring up a lot of great points. One I'd like to address first off is we have to be nuanced in our understanding of business success, right? So while there are high statistics for business failure, those statistics go way, the business success rate goes way up on their second or more business, right? So if we have people who've already ran businesses, even if they failed, the success rate skyrockets, right? That's something that we have to start to have that nuanced view and perspective when we're making some of these decisions. If it's their third business, it goes up even higher, right? So that's kind of the first thing that I think we kind of have to understand. The second thing is, right now, like there are times during this past couple of years where if you wanted to buy a house, you couldn't, right? And if you are buying a home, the rate at the price at which you had to purchase that home probably didn't leave a whole lot of equity on the table, right? So how long does it take to pay that to create that equity in a property? It takes a pretty long time, right? You have a 30-year, you factor in amortization, you're like, what, 15 years in? Unless someone like gifts you a home, or you inherit a home or something like that, like it can be a challenge to have equity. So we're looking at automatically a very small like sliver of people who have enough equity in their collateral in order to be fundable. And there's definitely more people than that are going to be successful. I think that there's factors like time in business, if they've if they've done it before, if they've led and managed people before, that also play into that role, that into those numbers of success numbers as well. And unfortunately, we don't nuance the high level percentages of business failure rate with some of those other factors. And we see that reflected in the banking world, unfortunately. There is a little bit of a lack of nuance in some of those factors. The other thing I would say though is team is another one, right? Like if you have if you have a strong team and that team has a lot of continuity working together and that team has a lot of experience, the business success rate also skyrockets. But with that being said, I think that I think that we do have to become a little bit more nuanced in our understanding from an underwriting perspective of what can and cannot work. I think that there's a large proportion of businesses that don't have collateral just as a business model, right? If you think about a barbershop, like barbershops make money. If you have a successful barber, you know, that's looking to open up a new space, right? They have a strong following. They're making six figures in net revenue, a year, but they don't have any collateral, right? So then what do we do? And that extends out to plumbing. That extends out to so many profitable business models. And I think that we have to start to move beyond. We can't be lazy in our analysis. We can't lump all small businesses together from an underwriting perspective and say, hey, they don't have a 750 credit score and X amount of collateral, so we have to say no, right? We're leaving so much money on the table without analyzing some of those other factors, like their experience, how many businesses have they had before, if they have a strong clientele, their business model, things like that I know that, everyone says they analyze, right? But sometimes I find that, some of the underwriting standards don't necessarily reflect the insights that some of the bank leaders have into some of those areas. And so I think that, we do have to nuance our understanding a little bit more, but I think that that's where the CDFIs come into play, where, a CDFI can say, hey, if you have a deal that is cash flow positive, they got lots of money, coming in the door, low expenses, but not any collateral. We have a collateral replacement pool of funds here so that you can do, so it de-risks you so you can do that deal. or a loan loss reserve, here, so that we can share some of that burden if that person, with tons of cash flow, making six figures with a great net, but, they maybe have a 650 credit score, is entrepreneurship, right?
Right.
They might have, at some, like, it's not something that someone teaches you about credit, for a lot of entrepreneurs. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you, for lack of a better word, lump the SBA within that category to mitigate some of the collateral shortfalls that we lenders experience as well, to come in and help in lieu of that cash reserve that's available for collateral shortfall?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it completely separate, the SBA?
No, I think the SBA has a role to play as well. I think that the SBA isn't for everyone, right? So you have to have so many years in business. You have to have meet certain criteria that will naturally rule out a lot of people. But I do think that, like, if you're accessing, let's say, well, I mean, the standards change all the time, so I won't get specific, but the criteria for qualifying changes a decent amount, to where if you're an entrepreneur and you don't have a relationship with a SBA already, or with a entrepreneur support organization that can help guide you through that, it can feel daunting to you, right? And like, you gotta have financials, right? So if you go to someone and they're like, well, I've got to have a P&L and the XYZ, and like, they're gonna be like, wait, what are you talking about? I'm a baker, I make lots of money, but I've never, like, no one's ever came to me as a baker and said, hey, what's your balance sheet and profit loss, and what category did you put this expense in versus this, and at what levels are you depreciating your, like, they're not doing it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so for them, it can feel daunting. I think that's the importance of your entrepreneur support organizations, to help work with entrepreneurs, to help guide them through that process.
Let's talk about that. Entrepreneurial support organizations. Can you give me some examples, and how do you think they're playing a role in bridging that gap of actually clarifying, or at least smoothing the lines between the roads between an application to an underwriter?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that when you engage a bank, in finance, we have our own vocabulary. We use a lexicon that's our own personal patois, if you will, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. It's our own language and sub-language. And if you don't speak that language, you're already at disadvantage for funding, right? If you're in a meeting and someone says, do you have your pro forma? Right? Well, if I'm a plumber and I make $400,000 a year, $300,000 of which is profit, I may not have ever heard the word pro forma. In fact, chances are I haven't. There's very few places outside of finance where you hear the phrase pro forma. It just doesn't exist. And there's so many of those phrases and terminology that become commonplace to us in finance that no one else uses, but we don't realize that, right? It just makes the person seem like they don't have their stuff together if they don't know what we're talking about. And so I think that that's the role that ESOs play, is helping translate and really helping them prepare to talk to funders and to talk to financial institutions, so that they can be talking the same language, and they have the pro forma ready and they know what it is and what you mean by it, right? So I think that the entrepreneur support organizations play an outsized role in not only helping the businesses be stronger and increase the success rate. Actually, if we were talking about business failure rate, businesses that engage with the entrepreneur support organization have a 40% higher chance of success, like just by engaging with them, not long-term relationship, not whatever. And so that really speaks to the importance of having mentors that the entrepreneur support organizations provide, having those extra expertise and extra people who can help you navigate the world that is entrepreneurship. And so I think that like funding the entrepreneur support organizations is incredibly important, not just for those businesses themselves, but for making them bankable to us and making them, be in the best position to hire as many people as possible, pay as much taxes as possible, and help us reduce crime as much as possible.
Yeah. So can you list a couple of them that you think are currently contributing to that initiative?
Yeah, I think your SB
DC.
DTC, right? You always have to think about that,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
It's like which one?
yeah, right. I think like they're of course doing great work. SCORE is doing great work. Prospect Business Association is doing great work. I think your chambers, your Heartland Chamber, your Hispanic Chamber, Mid America, Gay Lesbian Chamber. I think that your Northland Chamber doing great work. I think that your KC Sourcelings and Missouri Sourcelings are doing great work. And I think that the city has begun to really invest in its BizCare office, and I think that BizCare is really doing some great work, and Nia is doing some great work down there to create access to capital. She needs more partners, right? So if you're watching this, like she needs more partners, and she needs, more, people to really engage with what she's doing. But yeah, I think those are some strong, entrepreneur support organizations. I'm sure I'm leaving off a bunch of important ones.
For
but
sure.
Yeah.
New that are up and coming as well. I've noticed.
Gift is another
Gift's
one.
definitely another one.
We have Porterhouse is another
Yes.
one. They're out there, but what I find is that if we don't address things as a community, whether it's as a private sector or as a public sector, then we leave it to people who don't really have the time to do it, but see that there's such a need that they can't help but address it. And I think that we see that with some of our nonprofits that address people who are falling through the social nets and the cracks there. But we also see it on the entrepreneur side. And so that's where a lot of these entrepreneur support organizations are at, is that for so long they've had to try to figure out how to get funding to at least do a baseline service that they know the entrepreneurs need, that they haven't had the resources to really fully draw out their vision, which is a vision for the city. It's a vision for economic development that we all benefit from, right? But unfortunately, without having the funding and having to constantly spend so much time chasing that funding, they don't necessarily have the ability to help move the needle for our city and ultimately for us.
Mm-hmm. Put a dollar figure on it. Not to, let's say, to solve the problem at a 50% rate in the next 5 to 10 years.
15 million a year. At 15 million a year. So in Kansas City, Missouri, I'll say 15 million a year, right? There are other cities in the region and other municipalities in the region, like Jackson County, like Wyandotte, Unified Government, KCK Wyandotte County, which gives nothing practically to entrepreneurship, despite having 60% of their revenues come from sales taxes, right? Well, who's paying the sales tax? Who's grabbing that sales tax for you, right? If we start to look at some of these things, then we can really look at why we're facing budget deficits and budget crises. We've got to invest in the things that have a return on investment. And in many cases, nationwide, others, almost every other city, lots of other cities have found that is small business support, and investing in small businesses and entrepreneurs has a strong ROI for the city and for their budgets. So with that being said, I think 15 million on the Casey Mo side, I think 5 million a year on the Jackson County side, really helps get us there. I think Wyandotte County is a beast, but they really should start looking at investing anything, in growing it, and I think they'll, if they do that, they'll find that that'll solve a lot of their problems they're facing. Yeah.
Okay, love it. All right, technology.
I try not to get myself in too much trouble.
Listen,
Might have some hot takes though.
No, we have to preface by the fact
these opinions are solely my own, and they are not representative of any of the banking institutions, CDFIs, or governments that we mentioned in this program.
Exactly. I was gonna say also, you're coming in from a meeting that you recently had, so you're like fresh off the skillet.
Yeah.
You landed right.
Yeah, we did just come from a meeting with some city council members, kind of talking about what entrepreneur support should look like in the city, and we have a phenomenal city council in Kansas City, Missouri, and so it's actually been really pleasurable experience working with them.
Okay.
I do have to say that.
Beautiful. Technology.
Yeah, and the city manager. City manager Brian gets it. Yes.
Okay. Technology. Let's see where technology can come into play. With AI coming into the space, it's like I can't stop talking about it. I mean, I don't think I'm the only person that I can't stop talking about AI. But where do you think it could come into place? Because yes, you go to chamber events, right? And then you meet with a lot of entrepreneurs that are up and coming. Recently, there was a company that got a seed funding, and what they're trying to do is really clean up businesses and make them attractive for CDFIs and other lending institutions to come in and just pick up and then say, all right, I can see how I can help this business. Do you think the gap is from the business, the entrepreneur, completing those forms, filling all the gaps, checking all the boxes, and coming into the application through the banker, or the gap is from the banker to the underwriter, or is it from an underwriter until the approval phase? Where do you see that piece that connects to actually get a business funded? Where do you think technology can come into place and fill that gap? Maybe I extended that question a little bit. I don't know if you followed, but where do you think technology can actually come in and fill that gap?
I think the technology can have an incredibly important role in helping us mitigate risk and make great decisions by providing additional data points. I want to kind of nuance this point by saying that AI and any technology is only as good as the people who build it, because when you're building any tech, any software, I used to be a co-founder in a software company. The code is written by a person or team, and it is almost impossible for them to not build in their own personal biases into that software, which is then potentially making very important decisions based on that mentality and thought process, right? And so, if you say, hey, track people who are highly likely to repay a loan, and that's it. That's just all the parameters you put on the algorithm. Well, then it's going. You're leaving it to its own devices to say, okay, well, from the data I have available, the person who's most likely to pay back a loan may be a Caucasian male between the ages of 55 to 65, right, with 4 kids and a current existing house and 3 cars and a boat. That might be the person. And so now the closer you are to that person, the more likely you are to get approved by default. So I say that to say that we just have to be careful and cognizant about the code that we're writing for assisting us in some of these things. But with that said, I think that right now, sometimes we aren't familiar. It's impossible for us in finance to be super familiar with every business model type, right? So we may not understand, the growth opportunity for a plumber or a drywall hanger, a barber. And we may just look at the numbers and it may not be aligned with what we're used to seeing. And I think that's where a technology platform like Foresight or like others can really come into play, because they can say, hey, barbers actually have an extremely high success rate. They may not have collateral and they oftentimes have low credit scores, but they actually have a very high cash flow, very high success rate, and great taxable numbers. And so, I think that providing additional context and background information and data to make decisions from our underwriting, perspective is going to be one of the biggest seismic shifts that we see. And it also, we can also help the entrepreneurs understand through some of this technology and AI, understand how to give us what we want, right? Because is it kind of crazy? Like, we, as a banking and financial industry, we say, hey, we won't take people if they don't have what we're looking for, formatted the way we're looking for it in, but then we don't tell anyone what the format is and the exact criteria. We have internal models, we have scales. We can tell you if it's auto approved or if it's not. We, know, okay, you get 4 points for this, you get 3 points for that in your application. But we're expecting people to give us what we want without telling them what we want. Right. And so, I think that there's a very big divide there. And I think that the technology and the AI is a phenomenal way for us to, for the financial industry and banking industry to be able to not necessarily give away their secret sauce, while at the same time, the people applying for the funds are able to still be giving us what we need, how we need it. And I think that's one of the biggest things I'm excited about for, the role that AI and technology can play in bridging the divide between banking and finance and entrepreneurs.
Do you think the investment from and that piece should come from CDFIs, or, like you said initially, from the city, or from entrepreneurs themselves?
I think it's all of the above. I think everyone stands to gain, and I think it truly is a situation where, that rising tide will lift all the boats. I think that there's, if we're able to bridge that divide, then even traditional, banks and lending partners are going to have more deal flow, more good deal flow, right? Right now, they're turning down a lot of potentially successful businesses or currently successful businesses, and because they're not speaking the same language, or they don't necessarily fully understand what their growth potential. And so I think that, that should probably be a yes and. Everyone should play a role. Whether it's the private sector, helping support and fund entities who are bridging that divide so that they can do more deals and make more money, or whether it's the public sector who has a revenue, a taxable income, interest in them hiring more, in businesses growing and scaling and hiring more people, or whether it's the CDFIs who are focused on community development and growth. I think that it really is a everyone type of thing.
All hands on deck. I understand. All right. Any final thoughts?
I think that, it's interesting to me. I always used to look at, at football teams and basketball teams, and I don't know much about baseball, so I don't really look at the baseball teams. But it looks like sometimes they had a checklist and they said, okay, we're at the scouting combine and this person is 6'6" and has a 30-inch vertical and bench presses this much and runs this fast. And it was always amazing to me throughout the years how those were accepted across the sports industry, across each sector, football, basketball, etc., as being like good metrics. And yet they weren't returning the results that you would expect if they were actually the best metrics, right? Otherwise, like, we would have more successful wide receivers if every fast receiver who could bench press X amount and jump X high, was the best product, right? Like our analysis for what we viewed as tier one players was fundamentally not necessarily flawed, but it wasn't the best model. And that's why so many number one picks and first round and second round picks were not successful, right? There were so many busts. And at what point, kind of relating sports to banking and to finance, at what point do we look at it and say, where is there room for growth in our model so that we're taking into account additional factors that can help us as a team grow and accomplish our goals while helping the players that are actually going to be, the most successful and give us the most upside in terms of earnings potential and things like that. And what I found is if you think about, it's funny, you had Tom Brady was, a seventh round pick. You have Brock Purdy, right? There, so many of the people that no one dared to believe were going to be successful were successful. And it's interesting because there was an interview with Tom Brady's quarterback coach where he said, yeah, I can look at someone and within 5 minutes know how far they're going to go in the league, right? We have to find the people who truly understand what's going to be a success and has a surety around that and incorporate them into our model building so that we can get to a higher place in terms of our revenues, in terms of the deals we're making, and have more surefire bets while also helping build the community that we're in. And so that's kind of how I view where we're at right now. Is unfortunately everyone has a standardized checklist, but just like all of those first round and second round draft picks aren't all superstars, clearly there's some opportunities for us to evolve our models and incorporate other people who have more knowledge and intel and data and technologies and AIs that can give us the data that we need to truly find the people who are going to rise to the top and be great at a very high percent level.
I understand. That makes sense. Well said. Where can people reach you? Where can they find you? Website, business name.
Yeah, Rise Consulting Group. I am proudly supporting Holy Rosary Credit Union, which is a CDFI here in Kansas City, who's really trying to do some of this work. So shout out to the Holy Rosary team. Great leadership, great board. And and great team. And you can find me on LinkedIn at Eze Redwood, EZE, and then Redwood is in the tree.
Beautiful. Thanks, Eze.
Yo, thanks so much, man. It's been a true pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great.